Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Mike Balkwell, and tonight I'm here in my role as the campaign director of the Reform Gravel Mining Coalition. This is a follow-up to our November meeting on Bill 23. At that meeting, David Donnelly spelled out for us, our lawyers, spelled out problems that groups working to oppose gravel mining in their community would face as a result of Bill 23. And also set out demands communities could make of municipalities if those changes were made. And we were previewing those changes, and we were calling it a municipal action plan that we would need to prepare for in January if those things went ahead. We asked you then to be part of a pushback campaign, and many of you did many things along with many other people in Ontario. And that pushback was successful in some very important ways. And we're going to hear about that tonight, and we're going to want to celebrate tonight what we were able to do together to stop some of the things that were being proposed in Bill 23. However, there are still some issues, and municipal action is still necessary to protect the health and safety of residents and to protect the environment. And tonight, David Donnelly is going to update us with a review of Bill 23, help us set out the demands we must make of municipalities now and starting in the new year when the councils resume business. So that's going to be part of tonight's agenda. We're going to be turning the order of the agenda around, though, and be hearing first from Susan Robertson, the planner. And we talked at the last meeting about an ICBL strategy, interim control bylaw strategy. We heard from David Sylvester from Forks of the Credit Preservation Group and from Mayor Annette Groves, the mayor-elect of Caledon. There was a detailed presentation on that strategy and why it was important and why we were moving forward with it, why it could be a tool that other municipalities could look at. And Susan Robertson will take us deeper into that strategy. Then we'll come back to David Donnelly and talk about Bill 23 and summarize all of those things in terms of a municipal action plan that we're talking about to launch in January. Finally, we'll go into breakout rooms. It's been a year. It's a year ago, January. So it's been 12 months since we launched this campaign. And we want to hear from you, hear your feedback. How's it been for you? How do you think we're doing? What do you think's happening with the Ford government, with the gravel mining industry, with municipalities? What's important for us to celebrate about the last year and begin to think about as we head into the new year? So that's the agenda that we have for tonight. But first, it's with a very heavy heart that I tell you that Jenny Laforestier passed away on Friday. Now, many of you know Jenny, and many of you have already heard the news, although you may have just heard it recently. Many of you may not know Jenny, and I assure you that she's a giant whose shoulders many of us stand upon. Very pleased, and I'm going to introduce Cheryl Connors, who's a longtime friend and co-conspirator of Jenny's. Cheryl's going to share some thoughts and reflections and pictures about Jenny with all of us. We'll follow that with a minute of silence before we resume our meeting. Cheryl, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you. And I'm just going to start sharing my screen here. Just slideshow. Play from start. Okay. Okay, thank you. And I will try to do this without crying, but I've been told I have permission to cry. I'm going to read because I have I knew I wasn't going to be able to do this on my own. But we have lost our beloved friend, Jenny Laforestier, after a short and brave fight with cancer. Many of you know Jenny as the community leader and passionate advocate for protection of the environment, building movements across projects threatening water, farmland, endangered species, the natural environment, and heritage. She was a strong voice fighting for Indigenous consultation and sovereign treaty rights. Jenny's clear, articulate vision and advocacy was well respected throughout Caledon and Peel, as well as the broader Ontario environmental community, making her a frequent commentator in the media. Jenny was a force, an active contributor in the many environmental groups she worked with, including Gravel Watch Ontario, this group, Reform Mining Gravel Coalition, the Peel Enviro Hub, the Coalition for the West Crowded River, and the Stop the 413 and Stop Sprawl movements in Ontario. She formed the Dufferin-Caledon Enviro Press Desk to create media awareness of the many environmental issues impacting her community. She led the Bell Fountain Community Organization and served for many years on the Town of Caledon Heritage Committee. She was the 2021 Green Party candidate for Dufferin-Caledon. Jenny was a gifted musician, music teacher, avid hiker, and had a third-degree black belt in Aikido. And of course, we have to talk about Jenny's smile, that megawatt smile that would light up any room she was in. Jenny had a warmth and compassion that enveloped everyone she was around. She fought to hold politicians accountable to the public interest, and she fought to make the world a better place. She made all of us be better. Our hearts break for her many friends and family, but especially her husband, Alistair, daughter, Josephine, Joe, mom, Janine, and brother, Chris. And just so you know, her daughter, Joe, just turned 13 2 weeks ago. For anyone who knows Jenny, her daughter, Joe, was her everything, her whole world. Every cause that she took on, every fight she led was a battle to ensure the world Joe would be growing up in would have clean water, air, natural places to walk in, and farmland to grow food for Joe and for all of our kids to have a future. A reporter in the Toronto Star called Jenny a thorn in Doug Ford's side. But for anyone who knew her, she wasn't a thorn. She was a beautiful rose, kind, generous, loyal, and loving. For those who were blessed to call her a friend, her loss is immeasurable. Jenny approached her cancer with the same strength, positivity, and fight she approached everything in life. But you should know, in Doug Ford's failed healthcare system, Jenny didn't receive appropriate and timely diagnostics. The first time she went to an ER, the doctor told her to take 2 Tylenol and go home. It happens in an overburdened ER when the docs are just trying desperately to clear the room. By the time they finally found the cancer, many months after they should have, after having never receiving the life-saving diagnostic imaging, Jenny never had a chance. I know a lot of people were shocked by the news of Jenny's passing. Jenny didn't want to tell people she was sick. She was just so determined to beat that damn cancer. She never stopped fighting with every ounce of strength in her body to stay here for Joe. Jenny wasn't ready to go and never said goodbye. But when we gathered by her side in what would be the last time I saw her, she very clearly said, "I love you, and I will hold those words with me forever." During that same visit, Jenny looked at me and fiercely said, "I will survive." We knew her time was short, and her mom and I just looked at each other. I didn't know what to say. I just said, "I love you." Another close friend helped me understand that our beautiful Jenny will survive. She lives on in her lovely daughter, Joe, and I'm asking all of you today to let Jenny's spirit continue to live on through you and the work that you all do. Let us create an army of Jenny's thorns to continue to be a pain in Doug Ford's side. And if you can find a way to help, we have created a GoFundMe in Jenny's memory. Jenny's dream was for a beautiful and talented daughter to attend the Ontario College of Art and Design. If you can find it in your heart, we would appreciate it if you could help Jenny fulfill that dream by donating. I'm sure you can understand, but with COVID affecting Jenny's business, Jenny's illness, and the perils of self-employment, Jenny's family would appreciate the help. So please join me now in a moment of silence to acknowledge our beautiful friend. Thanks.
Thank you, Cheryl, for bringing Jenny into the room with us tonight. At our last meeting, take me a moment to recover, folks. It may take us all a minute or two to recover. At our last meeting, we talked about Bill 23 and how it included provisions that would take away from residents the right to appeal to the Ontario Land Tribunal. And that clause was removed from Bill 23 before the bill was passed. So as a result of the pushback that you did, that others did, that everybody did, that we all did together, that was defeated. There were other provisions in Bill 23 which would have sped up the production of aggregate extraction. And those provisions were removed as well. And David Donnelly will speak to the details of those a little more when he presents later. Those were significant and major accomplishments. And I think it's, a good thing for us to take a moment and, in Zoom land here, reach over to the person next to you and pat them on the back, who's ever next to you on the screen, because together, all of us, plus other people, many other people across Ontario, force them to walk that back. So that's an accomplishment of which we should all be proud, and we should take lessons from the importance of pushing back. As we know, pushing back and defending is not enough. The Ford government took advantage of the space between the election of new councils, the stepping down of old councils, the stepping up of new councils, to rush this through. And so we all had to rush and push back, and there are things we accomplished. As David will say later in his presentation, the bill did include a provision that would allow the Ontario Land Tribunal to assign costs against the losing party. And that's going to have a chilling effect. And again, I'm not going to speak too much to that right now. Later in the presentation tonight, David will speak about that, and we'll speak about some strategy around that. We don't always want to be on defense. We can use the language of offense. We want to go on the offense, or we want to be proactive. And so we talked last time, as I mentioned, David Sylvester from Forks of the Credit Preservation Group and Annette Groves, the mayor-elect of Caledon, talked about an interim control bylaw strategy. And you may recall from our previous meeting that an important part of making the case to the Caledon Council to impose an interim control bylaw was some research and a study and a presentation which Susan Robertson made. Susan's with us tonight. She's going to speak in a moment. Which Susan Robertson made on behalf of Forks of the Credit Preservation Group. She did the work together with Alan Ramsey, another planner, and they reviewed the aggregate policies of the top aggregate producing municipalities, and found Caledon to be at the bottom of the list, to have the least effective, the least substantial, least comprehensive policies. And that was instructive for Caledon. We then began a conversation with people, some of you who are on this call now, who we were calling affected communities affected by gravel mining applications, and talked about moving this interim control bylaw strategy forward with other municipalities. So tonight we're going to provide some more information to you about that. Susan's going to take us a little deeper into the issue. Susan and I may go back and forth with each other here a little bit in terms of describing this to you. The purpose of the presentation is to inform you about it, and we'll be exploring the advantages to specific communities to consider asking their municipality to pass an interim control bylaw, but we'll also be talking about its collective benefits as a way to advance reforms of the gravel mining industry. And we'll conclude by asking whether there's some of you who are in communities in additional municipalities who might be interested in this strategy too, as we're forming a working group to carry this initiative forward. So with that as background, I'm very pleased to invite Susan Robertson to the stage. I'll let Susan give you a more formal introduction of her background, but I just want to tell you she's terrific to work with, and we're very happy to be in partnership with you. So Susan, over to you.
Wow, thanks so much, Mike. That means a lot coming from you, and huge thanks to you, Cheryl, for that beautiful tribute to Jenny. You know, she struck me as a very passionate, dedicated woman, so she lived well. And let's honor her memory by continuing the fight that matters to all of us so much. So hey, everybody, good evening. I'm Susan Robertson. I'm greeting you from Treaty 19. That's Chief Adjutant's Treaty. I'm a watershed planner by trade, and a Scottish-Irish settler that I've lived in Anishinaabe territory my whole life, I like to say, which is this part of the Great Lakes region. And I used to work for a conservation authority for about a decade. And when I had my first child, my daughter Fiona, who's actually the same age as Jenny's daughter, 13, my life pivoted a bit and I've started my own business, which is People Plan Community. So I believe in watershed planning and environmental planning and making those things happen in Ontario. What a novel concept. So on that note, if I could start my presentation, that would be great. Thanks so much. So this is a summary of a policy report that was conducted for all the top aggregate producing municipalities in Ontario. There are technically, they call it the top 10, but there's 11, not to confuse anyone. So as I'm sure some of you know quite well, aggregate policy in Ontario, it's almost a bit of a blank slate in terms of approvals. There's highly permissive planning contexts. And so we thought, well, you know, given the mega quarry proposed in Caledon, let's take a comprehensive look at all the policies for all the top aggregate producing municipalities in the province and line them up against each other. Next slide, please. So these are the top 10/11. Number 5 is tied. It's both in Halton region though, so there's some consistency there. But we have the city of Ottawa as the top aggregate producer. And I just want to put a little disclaimer that it changes on an annual basis. You know, this is based on aggregate resource statistics in Ontario from 2020, but, you know, sometimes other municipalities will produce more tonnage per year. So here's the 11, Ottawa at number 1, Hamilton at number 2, as of 2020, Kawartha Lakes at number 3, North Dumfries at number 4 in terms of total tonnage, Burlington and Halton Hills tied right in the middle. We have Zora at number 6, Puslinc at number 7, Severn Township at 8, Clarington at 9, and the town of Caledon ranked at number 10 for total tonnage per year. Next slide, please. So we asked ourselves, how are we going to line this all up to compare all the official plan policies against each other? So we started by gathering all their active official plans, so not ones that are under appeal or in draft. We took everything that's in effect. And then we identified aggregate and environmental policies that we could use almost as like a metric to compare them against. So what are we looking for? Then we reviewed, once we identified our categories or themes, the strength of each policy in accordance with the Harvey-Ball system. I'm not sure if people know that, but it's like a measuring tool using symbols. Then from there, we did the ranking and tabulated the results based on themes, those 9 environmental themes and the 11 municipalities. And we came together with our final results. So that's our method. That's how we did this. Next slide, please. So here's a Harvey Balls. I thought I would just show them just in case people are unfamiliar with the concept. So we used the balls first and then we scored them. So we could use some like numeric analysis as part of the assessment, a policy assessment. So a full Harvey ball was for strong, detailed, prescriptive policy context with several tests for approval, like as well as several municipal policy references. So within all the 9 environmental themes, which I'll show you in a second, this is how we did it, okay? And clearly define study requirements to assess those themes in relation to the application. A half Harvey ball or an average score was really kind of just more for deference or reference to provincial requirements, more than one policy reference and a study being required. A quarter Harvey ball or a score of 1 was a minimal policy reference and just deferring to provincial acts and provincial processes. And then a 0 or an empty Harvey ball was just for no mention whatsoever. So this was the methodology that we followed, just to try to be as transparent as possible, so everybody could get a sense as to how we did this, right? Next slide, please. So these are the 9 policies we used, or themes rather, environmental themes in terms of social, cultural, environmental impacts. So we looked at air quality, and this is not really listed in any particular order. They're just listed here alphabetically. So we have air quality, blasting, cumulative effects, First Nations consultation, haul routes, hydrogeological, natural heritage, noise, and surface water. So hydroge being underground or water below, like water below the surface, and then surface water being rivers, wetlands, lakes, etc. First Nations consultation being meeting the legally obligated requirements under the Constitution Act for duty to consult and accommodate. Cumulative effects, just to be clear on that, are assessing the impacts of things over time. So like almost the aggregate, for lack of a better use of a term, impact of a certain action, and it's how it impacts other things, and sort of the ripple effect of things really over time or in relation to each other. I think the rest are pretty self-explanatory. Blasting is, impacts from open pit mines or noise, fly rock, etc. Next slide, please. So here's the scoring that we provided. While we'll recognize this presentation is geared a lot towards Caledon, we can also point out that no municipality scored over 65%. So while Hamilton did the best, nobody's doing really well. And so, that's a problem. And I think in some ways for myself, it is somewhat predictable. Not just the environmental policy regime that we're in presently, which we all know I don't need to elaborate on, but just generally aggregates being such a contributor to the economy have had a lot of influence in what is normally considered rigorous environmental policy. So Hamilton did the best with a close tie to Ottawa, and Caledon, Severn, and Coastlink are really the bottom 3, with Burlington being the top 3rd. Next slide, please. Out of the themes, blasting was the lowest, next to First Nations consultation. So there was very little reference to blasting policy in all of these 11 official plans. That's kind of surprising. It can be a big issue. First Nations consultation, well, I want to say it's surprising. I know professionally that it's not, that there was very little reference. Some of these official plans are a little out of date. I know the likelihood is if they were new and more current, there might be better policy strength in that department, but there's very little reference to that. Also very little reference to air quality, cumulative effects, etc. So this is kind of how we scored on the 9 themes, with hydroge being the strongest, which is probably a legacy of Walkerton and other things. Next slide, please. So these are the 3 most important results that we can learn from a comprehensive assessment of all the top aggregate producing municipalities in this province. Number 1, nobody scored over 65–70%. Nobody did. Nobody is, knocking it out of the park as it relates to aggregate policy in the province. Number 2, while we know Caledon scored the lowest consistently out of all the 9 themes, there's other municipalities that are a close second. And really, number three, the most important results is that really doing an assessment like this kind of gives us a level set or a barometer check as to how we're doing provincially with the state of our aggregate policies for the biggest producers. Like, this is a significant amount of tonnage that they're hauling out of their municipal boundaries every year, or within, in some instances. And so, it gives us that kind of temperature check on how everyone's doing and really where we need to improve. And it looks like there's a ton of work to be done. So on that note, I'll take you to the next slide. What are the advantages of this type of assessment? Like, what can we learn? It's applicable to all the other municipalities, not just Caledon, right? Like, there's 10 other municipalities in the top 10. The advantages are that it can give a pause on existing applications through ICBL. So we can hit the pause button a bit and say, you know what, there's clearly gaps in the analysis required to effectively review the strength of the application. And so ICBLs are good that way. They can give time for more careful reflection. Number two, it creates the opportunity to work together better, which is really important, not only with municipalities, but between municipalities, as well as First Nations, where cumulative effects are important and often under evaluated, as we've seen, based on the scoring of that environmental theme, right? So with that pause, we have an opportunity to go bigger tent and to work better together. And number three, probably the most obvious, is that it's really pushing the envelope for better practices than what we're traditionally seeing in the planning profession as it relates to aggregate policies. So, there's an opportunity here to move the envelope, and there's a lot of concerns with respect to aggregates, across this province and within many treaty areas. I think there's 34 in Ontario, 34 treaties in the province of Ontario. So there's a lot of concerns, right? And this is just an opportunity for us to try to reevaluate and decide where we want to go next. So I think I'll pause right there for you, Mike. That's my last slide.
Thanks, Susan. There's whoops, my screen just shifted. Okay, so Gord Gord, I have to pause there, folks. Everything was switching quickly, and my eyes were distracted and following it. We're going to take any questions that you have. There's one there from Gord now. We're going to watch for other questions. And by the way, somebody asked a question which Brian Smith answered. Thank you, Brian. Excuse me. So Gord Pinard's question is, what score would you expect to be a reasonable expectation? Are you aware of any communities that meet that standard that could be used as a benchmark?
Well, that's actually a great question. And I mean, we can look to ourselves and say, what are you happy with? You know what I mean? Like, are we looking for 60%? I know I'm not. That was never a grade I was comfortable with. So, like really 75% would be a lot better than what we're looking at. And I think it depends on the theme too. So we have to decide. We have 9 themes there. So, we have to think about where are the themes that we really care about? What are the ones that maybe we care about all of them, and that's good too, but maybe there's some areas that we really need to make sure there's greater assessment or greater rigor on. I'm not aware of any communities that's beating this, but that's kind of part of the goal that we hope to talk about here tonight, was to try to find the gold star. Where's the gold star? Is it just Hamilton and Ottawa right now, which is just 65%? Where's the real gold star? Because right now we're sitting at a bronze. So let's try to find the gold star. Is there one in Canada? Do we have to look abroad? Where are other aggregate policies that are more reflective of good environmental planning?
Susan, there's a question, what does leaving it to the province mean? I think in your rating scale there, Romera and Kawartha seem to say that they have no power. It's a provincial issue. So do you understand the question?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. So
Okay.
it's just deference to the act. You know, they can work within the act to be more permissive or prescriptive within the work that they can do on their own level. A lot of the time, truthfully, like Ramera might not have the staff. They might not have people they can rely upon. So they're going to contract out people from their municipal budget to push the envelope on certain things where they feel like they might lose the battle anyways. So sometimes that's a big issue. But the problem is if they don't set a bar within their official plan policies, then it's almost anything. It's just anything goes. So when they're deferring to the provincial act, they're just saying, oh, well, we'll just let the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing or the Ministry of Natural Resources and Forestry deal with that. We're not gonna take that on. That's Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, or they changed the name again, but you know what I'm saying. Like they'll just simply defer to the act and say, and that's about as far as it goes, right? So they don't look to have greater study requirements where their staff are evaluating things internally on their end in relation to the strength of their own policy. It's highly permissive and just deference to the province. So I hope that helps.
And if it doesn't help enough, Barbara, please ask a clarifying question. Bill Davidson, you put a question in the chat, but the word before category is, I think, got a bit jumbled up. So if you could just clarify your question, we'll ask it. Doug Tripp asks, some lower tier municipalities do not have an official plan. Is there a policy framework that applies to this model in the absence of an official plan?
Well, I wonder if it would be the county or the region, if they have a county or a region. So that would probably be the point at which they would defer. You know, I would imagine if there's no municipal official plan, I might have to defer to David on that one. You know, there isn't always municipal government in certain parts of the province, like further north. Sometimes there isn't municipal frameworks in place, right? But I don't know. I would think that they probably have to defer to the upper tier, or maybe they would partner with an adjacent municipality. They would kind of leverage resources where they could, but maybe David would be more equipped to answer that.
Okay, so we'll save that part for David when he joins us. I'm watching to see if there's any other questions, and I'm going to speak again a little bit about the strategy here for a minute, and I think in about 5 minutes we're going to bring David on. There are benefits, as Susan pointed out, to you in your community if you're facing an application. There are benefits, and I always preface these comments by saying I'm not a lawyer, and I'm summarizing what I believe I've heard David Donnelly say, and he'll be on later on. He can correct me for anything I get wrong here, but an interim control bylaw can postpone an application by a year or 2 years. So it can slow things down in your community, which can have benefits. And the bylaws that get created during that period can increase the rationale or the reasons for the municipality to say no to the application. And then it can increase the grounds or the criteria against which it's assessed at the OLT. So those are benefits. But there are two other benefits. One is in our broader campaign to reform gravel mining, postponing or delaying decision-making, adding up to 2 years to the process to make a decision gets us closer to the next provincial election. And so that our broader advocacy efforts and the possibility of defeating the Ford government and winning support from the opposition parties, as we have won on some issues like the moratorium, increases the chance of benefiting all of our communities. So delaying applications, frustrating them, has benefits, and the interim control bylaw is not just a delaying tactic. I don't mean it in that way, but it creates time to educate the council, to put more stronger bylaws in place, and for you to raise public opinion and build stronger community support for your position and opposition to the application. So all of those things our individual benefits and collective benefits. And as Susan said, and I'm just going to emphasize the point, that in working with several municipalities at once, we can elevate to a higher standard what municipalities are putting in place as bylaws. We can promote best practices. And those practices, as we advance them, are part of creating a higher provincial standard. It's part of the actual act of reforming gravel mining. So there's details to how we do all that we're not going to maybe get into tonight. But we've reached out to individual communities where residents groups have formed and are opposing gravel mining applications and who are part of the coalition, and several of them want to work together on this. If you're part of a municipality, either that is facing an application or maybe isn't facing an application, and you'd like to see there be stronger bylaws in place before then, and you would like to approach your municipal council to impose an interim control bylaw and do studies and review your bylaws around aggregate, please tell us through the chat, or maybe Rachel, you can put the campaign email in the chat for people, and you can email us and we'll follow up with you and talk with you about how to be involved with the working group. I think I'm going to say one more thing before I switch this over to David, and this is just a shout out to you, David, two-minute warning. At the Bill 23 hearings, the industry representatives for the cement industry, I think they're called Concrete Canada, and the delegate to the committee during the hearings from Concrete Canada was presenting shortly after the Caledon Council had passed the interim control bylaw, and that delegate said, "This is a very dangerous thing to be doing, and the province needs to get involved. There's a group out there," he didn't name us, unfortunately, we always like to be named, "there's a group out there that's organizing municipalities to pass interim control bylaws, and they must be stopped. The province must do something to stop them." So I always think if you get the industry's attention, you're doing something right. But I do think we do have to pay attention to this and be aware that there could be pushback around this. So I'm going to conclude this part. I'm going to invite David to the virtual stage to talk to us about Bill 23. And after that, we're going to do a brief summary about how this all comes together into a municipal action plan. David, welcome.
Thank you, Mike. And thanks to everyone for the kind words about Jenny. I've known her for probably a couple of decades. We started back in Bell Fountain dealing with a municipal Class A around hardening up that beautiful rural setting, and we've worked together on a number of projects ever since, and she will be sorely and dearly missed. Turning now to the matter at hand, which is Bill 23 and its impacts on land use planning in Ontario. As it was first proposed, it would have had a significant impact on land use planning, and in particular the rights of third parties and their appeal rights. This would have been particularly vexatious for citizens groups like people who are part of the coalition. I'm happy to say the bottom line is that a large component of Bill 23 was repealed as it passed into law, but there are still some troubling aspects to it that I just want to take you briefly through now. If we could have the first slide, please. I'll take you through the third-party appeals, the cost claims, how that affects Bill 23 affects aggregates, conservation authorities, and parkland dedication. If we could have the next slide, please. This is my biography. If we could have the next slide, please. Okay, so the most egregious part of Bill 23, or one of the most egregious parts of Bill 23 is that it purported to remove the rights of third parties, that would be citizens, to appeal decisions such as aggregate quarries, pits and quarries, to the Ontario Land Tribunal. This was a move on the part of Doug Ford simply to get rid of citizens, to get them out of land use planning. Our firm has undertaken a study of Ontario land use appeals, which in fact were local planning appeal tribunal appeals, or LPAT appeals, from the time of April 2018 to September 2019, when the regime switched back. In that period, there were something like 1,800 appeals by developers, and there were only a few dozen appeals by third parties. So the claim by the Ford government that it was third-party appeals that was slowing down the development approval process turned out to be quite untrue, and that we, in fact, are going to be producing a short report that will enumerate these statistics. But again, this was not a justifiable or rational decision. This was simply a measure to kick citizens groups out of the land use planning appeal process. I should add that thinking about it carefully, when you think about all the time and effort that we put into developing official plans and to electing our municipal councils, it's the municipal councils who are the guardians of those official plans and the bylaws. An amendment is something that proponents or developers consider to be somewhat sacred, that they have a right to these amendments. But in fact, it should be the opposite is true, that it should be the most extraordinary circumstances in which an amendment is granted. Frankly, the Ontario Land Tribunal and its predecessor, the Ontario Municipal Board, should serve citizens first. In other words, if you're a developer and you apply for an amendment to the official plan, an amendment to a zoning bylaw, I don't understand why there should be an appeal right to that. Your appeal route is through the ballot box, and that it's citizens, when their municipal governments betray them by approving a zoning bylaw or an official plan amendment, that should be the only time when an appeal is necessary. But in any event, I want to move on with the presentation. Next slide, please. So here we are, third-party appeals. These were reinstated when they amended the bill that was passed into law, not yet proclaimed, but passed into law November 22nd, 2022. The most troubling aspect was that the OLT now awards costs against unsuccessful parties, including third parties and municipalities, when someone is defeated at the Ontario Land Tribunal. I'll have more to say about that. Next slide, please. For aggregates, there was a provision in Bill 22, the original bill, that would have removed the 2-year moratorium on applications to amend official plan or zoning bylaws for pits and quarries. So when new official plans come out, there's supposed to be breathing room, that is to say, a 2-year period in which people can become conversant or familiar with their official plan, and it prohibits new applications, for example, for redesignating land as mineral extraction, for example. The Doug Ford attempted to remove this provision from the Planning Act. That happily was, that amendment was removed. We can have the next slide, please. Conservation authorities. So the authority of the conservation authorities has been significantly constrained. This is primarily in their regulated areas and their ability to comment on development applications. So we're not entirely sure how this is going to play out with respect to pits and quarries applications. But for example, our firm represented protecting escarpment rural land in the Nelson aggregate application originally back in 2010 to 2012. And the Conservation Halton was a significant participant in that land use planning hearing. And it seems now that whatever their commenting role, whatever their role would be, that has been somewhat constrained, and that Doug Ford is continuing his campaign against conservation authorities through Bill 23. Go to the next slide, please. I've put this in just because it's interesting to me. They have reduced the requirement for parkland dedication credit. So anytime a developer applies for a plan of subdivision, a new high-rise, a new subdivision, they're required to set aside a certain amount of land for parkland, so that people aren't stranded in a kind of an urban setting without green space, This has been shrunk significantly, cut in half effectively by the Ford government. And I'll show a graphic later to demonstrate just how draconian this measure has been. If we go to the next slide, please. So the major change that affects citizens groups who are opposed to aggregate licenses or really rezoning at the Ontario Land Tribunal is that now the tribunal has the power to award costs at the end of the hearing against an unsuccessful party. An unsuccessful party is someone who loses. Well, of course, aggregate companies have a winning track record at the Ontario Municipal Board and its successor, the Ontario Land Tribunal. And that means that anytime your municipal council summons up the courage to oppose and defeat an application for a new quarry, they then have to consider both the cost of hiring lawyers and experts to go to the Ontario Land Tribunal to fight the appeal. But secondarily, they now are faced with the prospect of having to pay the winner's costs. So, for example, in the Pearl application was heard by the joint board, but then partly the Ontario Municipal Board. That hearing dragged on for 1 year. It is perfectly conceivable that Nelson's costs in that hearing were upwards of $10 million for both the preparation and the execution of the hearing. Well, now a municipality will have to consider that as a possible payout from the municipality to the aggregate company if they are unsuccessful. Now, for third parties or citizens groups, environmental groups, this is a threat and a consideration. However, for those third parties or citizens groups who are incorporated, the benefit of that incorporation is that if you are assessed an adverse cost award, you can simply wind up the corporation and you are not required to pay the amount. Can we have the next slide, please? This, I think, is going to have a chilling effect on municipalities. I'm aware of one municipality in Durham region that now requires people who are supporting a council decision, whether it's pro or con, whether they approve or deny an application of the Planning Act. They are requiring parties to sign an indemnification saying that if the municipality goes to the OLT and fights an applicant or an appellant, and the municipality loses, the applicant or the appellant is forced or required to pay the municipality's costs if they are awarded. This is going to have a huge chilling effect on public participation in land use planning. Go to the next slide, please. The question is, what can you do in terms of stopping the OLT from making these awards, which in my view are unwarranted and frankly, nobody ran on a platform saying that they need to change the rules. This seems to me to be very clearly developer-led to frustrate and intimidate municipalities. The current rule under Section 29 of the OLT rules requires that in order to award costs, the tribunal must find that the conduct of a party has been unreasonable, frivolous, or vexatious. What does that mean? Well, for example, failing to attend a hearing event or failing to give adequate explanation or lack of cooperation for changing a position. Next slide, please. Failing to act in a timely manner, failing to present evidence, failing to make reasonable efforts to combine submissions. Next slide, please. Acting disrespectfully or knowingly presenting false evidence. These are rules that have been applied for years and in some respects have been applied properly and fairly. There are a number of decisions which are notorious where cost awards have been made against citizens groups. Perhaps I should produce a report on that someday. But I am aware of cases where these rules have been abused, but by and large, the rules are generally speaking prudent. These will now be tossed out the window if the OLT proceeds to embrace these changes to the OLT Act. Can we have the next slide, please? The question is, what should we do about it? People should contact their local municipal government, and you should say to your council, I did not vote for this Ford government to change the rules around costs. I did not hear in the municipal election campaign that these changes were coming. I want my council to write to the chair of the Ontario Land Tribunal, and I want that municipality to tell the OLT not to change the rules around costs. The Act says that the cost claim awards may be made, but it's the rules that ultimately govern the proceedings, and that is entirely at the discretion of the Ontario Land Tribunal. Municipalities, including the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, must write the OLT chair and demand that the rules not be changed. If they are to be changed, then there's to be full public debate, consultation with affected stakeholders, including municipalities and First Nations. Those are the only conceivable circumstances in which the rules can be changed, but the rules should not be changed. Nobody campaigned on it. Next slide, please. This is the details around the proposed change to the exempting pits and quarries. That section has been removed. I provided this detail in case someone wants a copy of the slide deck. Next slide, please. Here's the more with respect to the pits and quarries in the 2-year moratorium. Next slide, please. Again, this is that the comprehensive zoning bylaw, again, the moratorium has been exempted. Next slide, please. Conservation authorities. This is the limits that have been put on conservation authorities. This has remained in the bill and will affect conservation authorities' ability to comment on and participate in OLT hearings, including involving new pits and quarries. Next slide, please. Parkland dedication, as I mentioned, has been significantly reduced. That combined with the development charges, which again have been significantly reduced, is going to cost municipalities a significant amount of money. I saw that in Vaughan, the estimate over, I think it's the 10-year period where they're going to be building the allegedly 1.5 million houses, is going to be upwards of $600 million. This is going to reduce the municipality's ability to fight aggregate quarries. This is a major consideration. And the loss of parkland is something that, again, is going to embolden or enhance the ability of aggregate quarries to say, and Gord Pennard at Core can certainly tell you this, one of the main selling features that Nelson Aggregate is promoting in terms of its new mega quarry they're proposing for the height of Mount Nemo is that there will be an enormous public park created 75 or 100 years from now that will augment or add to Burlington's parkland inventory or legacy. Well, instead of using giant holes in the ground to create new parkland, we should have kept the parkland dedication credit that we had in our Planning Act. No one campaigned on a platform of reducing parkland for new subdivisions. That's insanity. Now, the city of Vaughan, which is no leader environmentally, has produced an interesting graphic which shows you in very stark terms what this reduction in parkland dedication will mean. Next slide, please. These are the standards. It's essentially cut in half. I could have the next slide, please. This is what parkland dedication looks like under the current standards. You see the density, and then you see that for each new high-rise building or complex, you see the amount of parkland that is required by law to be created to service as a public amenity the people like you that live in those buildings. Now, under Doug Ford's changes under Bill 23, here is the result with respect to the new parks that will be created. Next slide, please. There they are, the new parks that these people will be forced to use when they live in this denser urban environment. If we can just go back to the previous slide. Current parkland, next slide. Doug Ford's Bill 23 parkland. Again, this advantages in a somewhat oblique way, but advantages quarry companies who are now going to be advertising their rehabilitated pits and quarries as the parkland that we need because Doug Ford has cut the parkland dedication credit. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, third-party appeals are back. That's the good news. but the OLT may now award costs against unsuccessful parties, including municipalities. This will have a dramatic chilling effect on municipalities' appetite for opposing pits and quarries. The aggregate moratorium on lifting the moratorium has been rescinded. That's good news. The changes, there were no changes with respect to substantially fettering or constraining conservation authorities. And finally, the parkland dedication changes is going to disadvantage municipalities in such a way that they may be driven into the arms of aggregate companies who are promising new parkland if and when their quarries are exhausted. With that, thank you, Mike. Those are my submissions.
Thank you, David. Thank you for that presentation. And people have asked in the chat box, we will make these available to you. We will send out an email later this week with a summary of this meeting and include these resources, both from David and from Susan. David, there's some questions here. Can you confirm if municipal development charges will only be dropped for low-income housing, or is it for all housing developments?
So when the bill was first proposed, the development charges were proposed for low-income housing. I don't recall the development charges being dropped for all new housing, but that's something I would have to check. I don't know what survived in the final bill, so I'm afraid to say I don't know.
I can say that this question was asked to me earlier in the process when the bill was final bill was introduced, and I asked Jessica Bell, the NDP MPP and housing critic, that question, and she said it was not dropped. It was dropped for all housing development, not just affordable housing, because that was one of the defenses that the PC MPPs were using. But I also haven't seen a final clarification of that. So David, I think it would be useful if you could check that out and get back to us.
You'll have the answer before the meeting's over.
There you go. Okay. Jay Scott asked this question in terms of the proposed rule change, David, what, if any, benefit is there to the OLT if they follow these changes? If they were to follow if they were to assign costs or were to use the rule to assign costs, what, if any, benefit is there to the OLT?
Well, that's an excellent question. To the institution itself, this should be viewed as a major attack on the institution. The land tribunal, underscore the word tribunal, is not a court. In in Canadian courts, we have a rule that says costs follow the event. In other words, the loser pays. Interestingly, in the United States, you do not pay another side's costs except in extraordinary circumstances. So we have now embraced the litigation model in our land tribunal, which is not the case, as far as I'm aware, in any other tribunal. There's the Ontario Energy Board, there's a Landlord-Tenant Board, there are a number of tribunals in Ontario. It seems that the Ontario Land Tribunal is the only one that was singled out for this special treatment with respect to costs. And I'm deeply suspicious that is because this advantages the development industry and the development industry alone. It's a very peculiar sort of change that is targeted at or in favor of one particular industry, that being developers. So for the institution, this should be a massive regression. The tribunal is to be engaged in the search for truth. That's what administrative tribunals do. It is not a list or a litigation, a contest between two parties where there's a winner or there's a loser. Tribunals are to seek the truth and to create a better environment or better land use planning. Ultimately, if you've ever been to the OLT, you know that they say, ultimately, the question is this good planning? That's what they're supposed to be examining. The only way you can know is to hear from the directly affected public, environmentalists, First Nations, and yes, developers. So as the institution should be horrified by this change to the law. Unfortunately, Doug Ford has made many new appointees that come from a very narrow background, development interests, consultants. There are very few new, experienced environmental municipal lawyers and planners who've been appointed. That's a great loss. So with the open for business mandate that Premier Ford seems to have given the tribunal, this may be seen as being advantageous in terms of reducing the number of appeals, which means increasing the number of approvals for developers. You have to remember that it's a huge percentage of appeals are developer appeals. Municipalities don't appeal decisions. Third parties rarely appeal decisions. In that interregnum that I talked about, during which the LPAT sort of reigned, in terms of third-party appeals that went to hearings, there were none in Markham. There was one in Vaughan. I think there were 3 in Brampton. There were 7 in the city of Toronto. And yet there were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of developer appeals. In other words, this is a process that is made and exists for developers to appeal the decisions of elected officials and to overturn your official plans. To now create a punitive cost rule is just further evidence that the public is no longer welcome at the Ontario Land Tribunal.
Very helpful analysis, David. Thank you. I know that you've got a time limit and you need to leave us shortly. I think there's one more question. We got time for one more question? And okay. And the question is, could you elaborate, from Bill Davidson, could you elaborate what we have lost by having conservation authorities disabled from the LPAT process?
That's an excellent question. This should be the subject of a careful dissertation. As recently as 10 years ago, conservation authorities, including the Toronto Regional Conservation Authority, were quite aggressive in terms of protecting their turf. Now, that was so in Southern Ontario, the GTA, for example, there's really only 2 types of land that we should be concerned about. The first is tableland. That's the stuff up out of the valleys that are not part of water courses. And then there are the water courses, the hazard lands, the streams, the ephemeral streams, the wetlands. And those are all areas regulated by the TRCA. In other words, they have jurisdiction over those lands. Now, over time, the TRCA became quite involved in landscape level planning, which is to say they didn't focus their interest to just the water course and to just the top of bank. But they started looking at impact zones and buffers, and then how those buffers linked into natural heritage systems and how those systems connected up to significant woodlands. In other words, they were the primary watershed stewards in, for example, the Greater Toronto Area with the TRCA and the conservation authorities elsewhere. Because these watersheds cross municipal boundaries or jurisdictional boundaries, they became the water keepers or the stewards of these ecosystems and these watersheds. And many of them took on a very significant role as being the defender of watersheds and all their components, including the wetlands, the forests, and so on. For a time, that knowledge, that interest manifested itself by having conservation authorities particularly comment on new development applications and in rare circumstances attend Ontario Municipal Board hearings to advocate for the protection of these systems, whether it be hazard lands, significant woodlands, buffers, species at risk, so on. Now, while those appearances were rare, it was my practice on behalf of citizens fighting to protect the environment to summons TRCA witnesses or conservation authority witnesses. So the TRCA, for example, is a wonderful agency. It has on staff planners, environmental planners, hydrogeologists, hydrologists, engineers, stormwater management engineers. I mean, all these people would review the applications, and where there was a disagreement between, for example, the developer and the conservation authority, we could summons those witnesses and come to testify. Probably a famous example would be in the Friends of the Grand Trunk Ravine, who were opposed to a development that was going to bifurcate an important east-west wildlife corridor on the Oak Ridges Moraine. Conservation authorities are now forbidden from being parties at the Ontario Land Tribunal, and they are heavily constrained in terms of their commenting authority on new development applications. In other words, they've basically been told to go back to regulating in the hazard land areas. So we have lost a significant ally at OLT hearings. Municipalities have lost a significant ally in terms of land use planning and commenting. And I guess my conclusion would be that if Doug Ford had run on that platform and won, I would say fair is fair. We're giving away our environment because that's what people want. But in all my travels the last 5 years, I have never heard a single person that said, take the TRCA out of land use planning. Conservation authorities out of land use planning. Make them do a better job. Make them go to more hearings. Make them be more comprehensive or aggressive in their defense of the natural heritage systems. I've heard that a lot. But not once did I ever hear, except from developers, take the conservation authorities out of the land use planning game. Well, in this particular case, the developers got what they wanted.
Again, David, thank you for this analysis. How's your time? We have a couple more questions. I know
you bet.
You're good?
I've got at least 6 more minutes.
All right. So I'm going to give you 2 questions. You got 6 minutes. One of them is, in Bill 23, the minister can order an amendment to an official plan if he's of the opinion that the plan is likely to adversely affect a matter of provincial interest, for example, aggregate. Can you discuss this, please?
So what I find so interesting is, we have these municipal elections, and we, there's Councillor Elgar, one of the greatest municipal councillors in Ontario history. And when you invest your confidence and your trust and your vote in Councillor Elgar, you expect him to represent your interests at council. Now, you accept that you're only one vote and you only have one councillor, and you're on a council of, 5, 7, 9, 13 councillors, but you understand democracy, you understand the democratic process. Then you invest your time and your energy in contributing to the official plan development, and you come up with policies that are designed to both facilitate development. Remember, in Ontario, we're required by law to have enough available land, a 20-year land supply for development. We have more than enough land to develop. And yet we create these official plans, and then Doug Ford creates the strong mayor's power, which says a mayor only needs 1/3 of council to overrule or overturn an official plan, a zoning bylaw, anything. But in that case, at least you've elected your mayor, you know who he is, and you can knock on his door, you don't like what he's saying. What this proposal is, like our current Minister of Natural Resources and Forests is from Bracebridge. I would warrant to guess that he probably knows absolutely positively nothing about most of the environmental issues in the GTA, for example. And so how is it that minister or any other minister who is unfamiliar with environmental policies or concerns, or even the sensitivities of this particular region, not the Canadian Shield, but in Carolinian Ontario, how is it that they could possibly hear from stakeholders, collaborate with municipalities, and override the municipality? It just doesn't make any sense to me. Now, we're in a time of climate crisis. I can imagine a far-fetched scenario whereby a municipality has done something that would compromise our ability to fight climate change, and the minister would intervene and override an official plan, something of that nature or magnitude. But in terms of foisting more aggregate on the citizens of Ontario, saying that it overrides a provincial interest, that's ridiculous. So I may have said this before, but I think it's worth repeating. Aggregates a natural resource. It's no different than timber, oil and gas, or fish. Companies don't own it. We do. And then we elect governments and we entrust governments to manage it in such a way that's sustainable. Well, how have we done with the fisheries? Oh, not too good. How have we done with oil and gas? We're in a climate crisis. How have we done with timber? Well, we're getting better, but it's not perfect. But the point is, we allocate the resource based on a rational understanding of its regeneration or renewal rate. Timber, we have timber management. You get a license It's for a select cutting based on what we think the biomass is and its regeneration rate. Fish. We fish based on what we assign a total allowable catch and then a license off that based on what we think is the regeneration rate of the stock. With aggregate, there's only one way to manage this industry, and that is based on the need. But we have never managed the resource that way. We have always given out as many licenses as can be applied for. It's time for a radical reimagining of the natural resource that is aggregate. We're literally giving it away. And so what municipal councils need to do, and you are the front line, you people in this magnificent, fabulous coalition, you have real influence with your municipal governments. Before there is a single new license approved in the province of Ontario, we need an ICBL to press pause. And then we need these municipal councils led by the Association of Municipalities of Ontario to demand that the Ford government manage this resource rationally, like we do all other natural resources. And that means we need a commission, a white paper, something that will tackle this issue that we have more aggregate approved than we need. And that then and only then do the stakeholders, the trustees, the shareholders in the resource, that's you, that's all of you, get a say in the management of aggregate. We did that with timber. We did it with garbage. We do it with fish. For some bizarre reason, we don't do it with aggregate, even though aggregate is the closest to home in terms of natural resource extraction impacts on the public. When we chop down trees in Northern Ontario, even though I feel that in my soul, it doesn't affect me. When we mine fish off the Atlantic Ocean and we take those fish out and we serve them up on the dinner table, although it hurts me that the cod are gone and the mackerel are disappearing, it hurts me, but it doesn't affect me. But when you send a gravel truck down a road where I'm riding my bicycle, or when you have the dust from those blasting that wafts over people's backyards and send them to my hospitals with those respiratory ailments, that affects me. When we have blasters who are not licensed in the province of Ontario, putting children that I know and go to schools that I pass by, you put them at risk, that affects me and that affects you personally. And so when I say that we should be managing this resource, I mean managing it as stakeholders, and we should have a far greater say in how that resource is allocated, because right now we're giving it away.
Thank you, David. If we were all in a room together, I think we'd hear a loud round of applause and a few rousing cheers, and I'm seeing some hands clap as we say that.
I'm channeling the spirit of Jenny Laforestier. She felt exactly that way, and I know it.
Thank you, David. Thank you for bringing her back in the room. There's a lot of appreciation, love being shown to you in the chat. Thank you for being with us. We're not going to kick you out, but we do know you've got a time limit, so you may leave before the meeting ends. Folks, there were a couple leftover questions there. We'll try and get back to you about those later. In terms of, just for a moment, in terms of resources we're going to send you, you will receive an e-blast this week. It should include a recording of this meeting. It should include access to both Susan and David's presentations. We're going to do a summary of the chat and provide that to you as well. To bring this together now in a brief closing before we go into breakout groups, in terms of a municipal action plan, we're going to create some resources for you, and we'll reconvene in January around this. But there's three things to ask your municipal council. One is, as David was saying, around for the municipality to write a letter, pass a resolution, write a letter to the OLT saying to follow Rule 23.9. I won't repeat all the details David said, but we'll create some language for you around that so you can make a presentation to council and ask them to write that letter. As David said, in that letter, your municipality can also ask the Association of Municipalities of Ontario to endorse that and intervene with the Ontario Land Tribunal. And I want to say that Doug Tripp on our steering committee, waved to the crowd, Doug, reached out today to Colin Best, who's a councillor in Milton and the president of AMO, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario. And we're working towards a meeting on this topic and seeking their support for that. So that's thing one. Thing 2 is to approach your community, pardon me, your council, if it's of interest to you or on an interim control bylaw, to work with other municipalities who are doing the same thing as part of a working group supported by this coalition. We'll similarly, we'll create talking points for you to go to your council. We'll create, there are draft interim control bylaws and rationales that you can use with your council. We can do training and preparation with you around that. And if you're part of the working group, we can monitor together how the municipalities react to our requests, to your requests. And we can also talk about bringing experts together in consultation with us to put forward best practices, high standards for all of those bylaws being considered by all of those municipalities. So if that interests you and you're not already part of the working group, either put your name in the chat, or I'm going to ask Rachel again if she'll put the campaign email there. And you can, if you have questions or you want to be part of that, let us know and we'll invite you in. So that's thing 2 to ask the municipality. And thing 3, I find it hard to say thing 3. Thing 3 is to ask your municipality to endorse the call for a moratorium on all new gravel mining applications until, as David says, there can be an independent commission, a white paper, et cetera, and we can reconceptualize gravel mining in Ontario and bring in necessary and important and needed reforms. So those 3 things are the municipal action plan that we've been putting together. We're highlighting that for you now. We're going to create some resource materials. We're going to bring us back in the new year, specifically those who are interested in the ICBL, and move forward on this. There are other initiatives we're pursuing as well. We won't go into all of those right now. We've been very focused around Bill 23 and its fallout. And so that's the summary of all of that for tonight. We're just going to conclude with some thank yous. Thank you all for being here tonight. Almost 400 people RSVP'd for the meeting. When you look down at the bottom of your screen where it says participants, that's the number of devices that signed in. And we were at I think about 150 devices, which normally means 2 people on average per device. So it was a big attendance tonight. There are other people who will receive the recording. I want to thank David Donnelly for being here tonight. I'd like to thank Susan Robertson for her presentation. I'd like to thank the steering committee for leading the breakout groups and for the leadership and commitment they've shown over the last year. I'd like to thank Rachel Veer and Horeen Hassan, who are the behind-the-scenes production team that organized and made this meeting go so smoothly. Thank you to them. And a special thank you to Cheryl for being with us tonight, for helping us remember and appreciate Jenny. And I know how hard it was for you to do that. And we appreciate you very much for being with us tonight. Ryan says, thank you to the organizers. And there's a saying that organizers like to say, which is bless the organizers for bringing us together. So bless all of you who are organizing all the work we've done together. There'll be lots for us to do in the new year. We've accomplished a lot this year. And we're going to leave the chat box open for a couple of minutes so you can say goodbye and say your thank yous. Any closing comments you'd like to make? But you'll be hearing from us this week with an email, and we'll be in touch again in the new year. A good holiday season, everybody. Take care, and we'll see you in 2023.